Sandstone Eco Zoo is slowly coming to an end, but we still have all of this space to fill. In the meantime, some gaps have been decorated and we've welcomed our first koala baby. Make sure to drop your name suggestions in the comments as we get started with today's episode. Hey everyone, Sparrow here. Today's build is pretty short and simple, at least for me, since it only took about 3 hours to build as opposed to the usual 8-ish. The only part of this enclosure that I had really planned is the shelter building, which we're going to build first. I went through a bit of a phase a while ago where I was super interested in building my own garden beds for the summer, and stumbled across an awesome video of a man building a little cabin out of wooden pallets. Thanks YouTube for suggesting this video to me, even though it's not at all what I was looking for. It looked so good that I knew I'd have to steal at least part of that idea for an animal shelter, especially since SEZ is all about recycling materials and using them in unexpected ways. So here we are building for the emus out of the jetty bedding platform in the Habitat tab. I decided this piece had the nicest texture and it would work well for what I had in mind. So 4 of these together, plus some of the planks and supports, as well as a painted sheet metal roof, and that's basically it. Hopefully it's enough room for the emus. During my research on emu farms and enclosures, I saw a lot of wood and a lot of mesh, so that's what we're going to go with. These wood-lined mesh pieces worked so perfectly for that, and it uses far fewer pieces than making our own mesh panel with 4 pieces of wood around it. I wasn't quite sure what shape I wanted for this enclosure. Definitely didn't want to keep it super rectangular like the plaster layout you see me working around. But that box does help a lot when it comes to measuring out the size of the enclosure. Even though I'm not following the edges exactly, or even super closely for that matter, if I extend my custom barrier past it on some sides and then cut through it on others to achieve a more organic shape, it should still work out size-wise, because that's how area and math works. And I know a lot of you are not fans of that, so moving on. I zoomed out a bunch to make sure I like the shape of it. We're going to end up editing that front area later because I didn't like how straight that one edge was. It doesn't need to be too tall, seeing as emus are flightless birds. They do like to jump up and run around though. I love that animation, and I've seen emus do that in real life as well. I learned later that apparently emus can run at up to 48 kilometers per hour. One of my favorite memories is from Wrocław Zoo many years ago, laughing at what we called a dancing emu with my dad and brother. It was probably the highlight of that zoo trip. It was so funny and looked like it was putting a show on for us. Once I'm more or less happy with it, we'll recolor the wood to a brown that's similar to the jetty bedding platform, and the mesh I actually decided to color green because it will help it blend with the plants so it's not noticeable, and it also matches the accents of our benches and bins around the night house. Into those custom barriers, I'm going to place a keeper gate near the shelter, and then I'll run my null barrier all the way around the edge so that we can get our emus in and figure out exactly what they need. And while that happens, our wombat had a baby! Look at how cute it is! Oh, I see someone running past with the box. It's so time to get back to our emus. With the emu in, I can check the traversable terrain and how much land area they have. Just double checking with the Zoopedia, and it looks like there's enough room in here for about 3 or 4 of them. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to adjust the panels on the front of the enclosure because I didn't like how straight that one edges, which will also give us more wiggle room when it comes to adding rocks and plants to the habitat. Always good to have some extra square meters available for that. Some terrain painting that I'm definitely going to redo later, just trying to map out where the more traveled areas of the enclosure might be with the sand and dirt. Next, I'll throw some bedding into the shelter, adjust the null barriers to allow for a water trough to be placed along the side of the barn. You can't place the trough if the barriers are too close, but after placing it, you can readjust the barriers to where they were, and it still works. Not sure why exactly. A food bowl right at the front, and also the big forage enrichment feeder. Here I have to thank Gunther for finally solving my war with terrain collision. Much better outcome than the Great Emu War of 1932. If you know, you know. Turns out there's a 4th checkmark called Disable Animal Navigation Terrain Constraints, and that's the one I needed to click to let me manipulate terrain around this. Thank you so much. Make sure to check out his channel and his Discord, links in the description. With some enrichment items thrown down, we're going to take care of the larger rockwork. I ended up using a mix of desert and savanna rocks, really enjoying mixing these styles. The desert rock is this warm gray-brown color with undertones of orange, which works perfectly for pairing with the more reddish savanna rocks. The savanna rocks are nowhere near as bright as the red desert rocks. They're a little closer to the dirt and sand color of the Australia map and blend in so nicely. Gives a little pop of color without being overwhelming. Near the sprinkler enrichment, I decided to create a tiny pond, make it look like maybe there's a dip in the ground here where the water from the sprinkler collects. For this, I like using the flatten to terrace tool because it moves the ground just the slightest increment so this dip isn't too deep. The emus can still walk through it, the sprinkler is accessible, and there's a bit of reflection off of the water. Some more rock work with the aquatic faux rocks. I'm very excited for all of the console players to get these in the Twilight and Aquatic pack release coming at the end of this month. I use this piece all the time and will be using it plenty more by the end of this episode. For planting, I wanted something more desert and grassland-ish with maybe a few temperate touches. This is an outdoor enclosure and we're in a grassland climate, so want to steer away from anything too tropical. Some cattail reeds by the water, coastal pigface of course. The coconut palm worked out well, as did the foxtail palm, cabbage tree, and silver fern. I don't want there to be too much height to the foliage. The emus are relatively tall animals, averaging at about 5.7 feet or 1.75 meters, which is taller than me, so we don't want to overwhelm that. For a mid layer, there will be some wattle bushes and triodia grass, while the base layer will be made up of that coastal pigface, a medley of grasses I made way back in the first episode and have been using all over, a little bit of bracken, and the dry spiny-headed mat rush. That all hopefully comes together to create an enclosure that's grassy but not too overly lush. And then I'll repaint the terrain based on our finished planting scheme. Our guests obviously need a way to see these animals, so here comes the pathwork. Not as painful as usual, which was very nice. Sometimes if I want the path to go along a certain edge, I'll push Control down on my keyboard and then it won't connect to the surrounding path, so I can place little bits where I want them and connect them afterwards. Sometimes that connection doesn't end up working, so your mileage may vary. But this time it did. And since this path is connecting near the Aussie Eats stand, I'll expand it to create a sort of triangular plaza. If you don't already know this trick, add a path offshoot and then delete it. The path will open up in that direction. Around the edge of the enclosure, I think I'm going to match the wombat and Tasmanian devil habitats with more faux rocks. We're going to cover the entire gap between the path and the enclosure with these, and then decorate that a bit with the grass medley, some more triodia grass, and the spiny-headed mat rush. Also placing some education boards here. These will have our custom SEZ graphics on them in the end cinematics, and then we're basically done here. One last step to get this area prepped, seeing as we've got loads of extra time this week, more flower beds. And by flower beds, I mean rocks and mulch and maybe some greenery, but mostly just grass. This will match the planting by the night house and also our new emu enclosure, and basically everything else that we have left to build in this zoo. If you think you know what else we're adding, let me know in the comments. Our emus look pretty darn happy in here. I'm going to call this a job decently done. Fingers crossed for some cute emu chicks in the future, but for now, Sandstone Eco Zoo has many other babies to take care of. Koalas, wombats, little penguins, and some future flying foxes. That's my cue to go manage some animals, I think. I will see you next time. Bye.